A warm summer night descended upon the western borders of the vast country, bringing with it a deceptive sense of calm. The air was filled with the scents of blooming meadows and dense pine forests, while in the high offices of the Western Special Military District headquarters, a tense, almost palpable silence reigned. The district commander, a man of strong build with a resolute face, accustomed to the winds and sun of military training grounds, sat poring over maps. The calendar read June 21st, 1941. In these last hours of a fading era, Army General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov was at the pinnacle of his career, wielding power over a colossal military machine. He did not know, and could not have known, that the clock of his personal destiny and the fate of hundreds of thousands of his subordinates had already begun its countdown, rapidly approaching the point of no return. The government telephone lines maintained an ominous silence, as if accumulating an electrical charge before the impending storm. This silence was heavier than artillery thunder. It concealed an approaching catastrophe of unprecedented scale. To understand the origins of the coming upheaval, it is necessary to step back several years and look at the path that led this man to the chair of commander of a key sector. The general was a living embodiment of the new military elite. His career developed rapidly, like an armored vehicle breaking through defenses. Behind him was the experience of civil confrontation in Spain, where, commanding tank formations, he earned the country's highest award and a reputation as a decisive, fearless commander. In the eyes of the highest leadership, he represented the ideal type of modern warlord. Devoted, energetic, thinking in terms of rapid breakthroughs and massive strikes. However, the rapid ascent harbored a hidden threat. The personnel policy of those years, accompanied by large-scale purges in the Army, created an experience vacuum at the highest levels of command. Positions that required decades of academic training and practice in managing huge fronts were filled by people whose experience was limited to commanding a brigade or division. They learned on the fly, mastering strategic art in conditions of escalating global tension. The geopolitical situation of the late 1930s dramatically altered the contours of borders. The state's frontiers moved far to the west, incorporating new territories. This political decision had extremely complex military consequences. Old, meticulously constructed fortified areas found themselves deep in the rear, while new defense lines in the newly acquired lands were only just beginning to be built. The troops of the Western Special Military District found themselves in a vulnerable position, pushed forward in the form of a gigantic salient known as the Belostok Bulge. This configuration was ideal for launching an offensive of their own, but represented a deadly trap in the event of a sudden enemy strike. This salient was open on its flanks, as if inviting the enemy's steel pincers to close behind the main forces. The military doctrine of that time categorically rejected the very idea of conducting prolonged defensive operations on its own territory. Regulations and manuals prescribed responding to any blow with an immediate, crushing counterblow, transferring combat operations to the aggressor's land. This offensive philosophy permeated the consciousness of the entire command staff, from lieutenant to army general, becoming an indisputable dogma that would soon confront the harsh and merciless reality of a new type of confrontation. The dawn of June 22nd tore illusions to shreds. A fiery squall descended upon sleeping airfields, barracks, communication centers, and railway stations. What began in these morning hours was not merely a border violation, it was a collision of two colossal systems, where one acted according to a prearranged, mathematically precise plan, and the other was caught at a moment of incomplete reorganization. The outer contour of the catastrophe began to form with terrifying speed. The information picture at the headquarters of the Western Front in the initial hours was not just incomplete, it was distorted beyond recognition. Wire communication, the basis of troop control, was severed by sabotage groups and destroyed by bomb strikes. Radio communication was used extremely reluctantly due to the strictest regulations on radio silence and fears of interception. As a result, the front commander found himself in the position of a person whose eyes were blindfolded and ears plugged at the moment a locomotive was bearing down on him. Reports, breaking through the chaos, fragmentarily reported on border battles, but the scale of the invasion remained unclear. The center, located in Moscow, demanded decisive action, insisting on an immediate counterattack and pushing the enemy out of the country. Obeying these orders and his own deeply ingrained belief in offensive doctrine, the commander issued orders for the deployment of reserves and the organization of a massive counterattack by mechanized corps. At this moment, the deepest internal conflict of a person making decisions in conditions of total uncertainty unfolds. The mind of a military professional, perhaps, suggested that throwing scattered, incompletely equipped tank formations against the accelerating blitzkrieg machine meant dooming them to loss. But pressure from above, multiplied by the fear of being accused of panic and failure to comply with orders, proved stronger. Directives went nowhere. Orders were given to units that by then were already dispersed or deprived of control. The general tried to lead a battle he did not see, relying on a map that no longer corresponded to reality in any of its points. At this time, the enemy's mechanized wedges, without engaging in protracted battles with resistance nodes, rapidly bypassed the main grouping of troops on the flanks. Moving at an incredible speed for that time, they cut communications, sowed panic in the rear, and inexorably converged in the area of the Republic's capital. Hundreds of thousands of people, thousands of units of equipment, huge warehouses with ammunition and fuel found themselves inside the tightening ring. This was a clash not just of armies, but a clash of fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. On one side, a flexible, decentralized tactic of maneuver warfare, where the initiative of local commanders was encouraged to maintain the pace of the offensive. On the other, a rigidly centralized, hierarchical system, where every retreat was considered a misdemeanor, and waiting for an order from above paralyzed initiative. An ideological conflict unfolded on the battlefields. A system built on total control and unquestioning obedience collided with chaos that could not be ordered by directives. Commanders in encirclement, deprived of communication and clear instructions, often found themselves unable to make independent decisions, which led to the disorganization of entire formations. The days merged into an endless succession of reports of breakthroughs, retreats, and lost divisions. The realization of the tragedy's scale came gradually, poisoning the mind with an icy premonition of the inevitable. The front commander, having left his safe headquarters, tried personally to restore control, moving along roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. But the efforts of one man, even one vested with supreme authority, could not stop the collapsing mechanism. In these moments of worldview transformation, not only defensive lines crumbled, but faith itself in the infallibility of pre-war doctrines crumbled. The general, accustomed to victorious communiques and the absolute superiority of his equipment, saw how the newest tanks burned, abandoned without fuel, how columns of troops were shot down from the air with a complete lack of cover. The turning point came by the end of the first week of the conflict, when the ring around Minsk finally closed. The Western Front, as an organized structure, ceased to exist. A giant gap emerged, opening a direct road to the state capital. The reaction of the country's top leadership was instantaneous and ruthless. The system, faced with a catastrophe of such magnitude, needed an explanation that would not question the infallibility of the system itself and its supreme leader. To admit that the cause lay in erroneous planning, miscalculations in assessing the timing of the attack, and shortcomings in strategic deployment would mean admitting one's own responsibility. A different explanation was required, simple and understandable to the masses, an explanation that personified guilt. At the very end of June, the general was recalled to Moscow. This journey became a transition from one dimension to another, from the chair of the front commander, whose decisions determined the fates of millions, he moved into a space of total powerlessness. His return was not the return of a military leader for a report, it was the delivery of a suspect. The climax of this human and historical drama unfolded not on the battlefields, but in the secluded, soundproofed offices of the investigative bodies. The interrogation process was swift. The investigator's task was not to establish objective truth, to ascertain the reasons for the lack of communication or the shortage of transport for transferring reserves. Their task was to formulate an accusation that would correspond to the demands of the political moment. Initial suspicions of conspiracy and conscious betrayal, typical of the paranoid atmosphere of recent purges, transformed during the investigation into accusations of a different kind, but no less fatal. He was accused of cowardice, inaction, panic, and deliberate collapse of troop control. In these formulations lay a deep, mocking irony. The man whose main flaw, perhaps, was a blind and overly zealous adherence to pre-war regulations and central orders in circumstances where they no longer worked, was accused of consciously sabotaging these very orders. The former commander tried to justify himself, citing objective factors, the overwhelming superiority of the enemy in the directions of the main attacks, the destruction of aviation at airfields in the first hours, the complete absence of prepared rear lines. He pointed out that the troops fought to the last, that many units perished entirely trying to fulfill impossible tasks. But these arguments were shattered against the deaf wall of a predetermined decision. The machine of justice spun with incredible speed, leaving no time for appeals and deep analysis. The closed court session took place in the second half of July and did not last long. The verdict was predetermined. The system demanded the highest measure of responsibility for the catastrophe. The court's decision was not subject to appeal and was executed immediately, forever cutting short the life of a man who found himself at the sharp end of the main blow of the most destructive war machine of his time. The elimination of the front's high command had an immediate resonance in the troops, but the effect was twofold. On the one hand, the cruelty of the punishment was intended to serve as a crystal-clear signal to other commanders. Responsibility for retreat and loss of control would be absolute. This led to a tightening of discipline, sometimes bordering on absurdity, when orders to hold positions were carried out even when it threatened the senseless destruction of troops in encirclements. On the other hand, fear of the high command paralyzed initiative. Commanders were afraid to make unconventional decisions, preferring to wait for sanction from above for every step, which, in the conditions of maneuver warfare, often led to fatal delays. The command system became even more inflexible, paying a huge price for attempting to solve the problem of competence through intimidation. Analyzing this drama through the prism of time, we are confronted with profound questions about the nature of responsibility, the limits of human capabilities, and the mechanisms of state structures in moments of existential crises. Who was this man, the main culprit for the collapse of the front, or a tragic victim of circumstances, a convenient figure for writing off the colossal strategic miscalculations of the highest political leadership? The truth, as is often the case in history, does not lie in a single plane. Undoubtedly, as a high-ranking military leader, he bears a share of responsibility for how the troops were deployed on the eve of the attack, for the inability to organize stable communications and reconnaissance, and for belated and inadequate orders in the first days of fighting. His experience leading tank brigades in local conflicts proved insufficient to counter a well-oiled strategic mechanism. He thought in terms of tactical breakthroughs, while the enemy was implementing a strategy of deep encirclement and destruction of entire armies. However, to blame one person for a systemic collapse is to simplify history to the level of a primitive myth. The tragedy of the first weeks lay not only in the mistakes of specific generals, but in the fundamental flaws of the system of training and management itself. The country was preparing for a different scenario. The information vacuum in which the troops found themselves, the dogmatism of military thinking, the repressed personnel potential, political restrictions on bringing troops to full combat readiness due to fear of provoking a conflict, all these were factors beyond the control of the district commander. He found himself caught between the hammer of the advancing enemy and the anvil of his own system, which did not forgive failures. The leadership's chosen strategy of finding a scapegoat is a classic pattern of behavior for rigid hierarchical structures in moments of crisis. By excising the affected organ, the system tries to convince itself and others that the illness is not systemic. This historical precedent resonates with modernity much more strongly than it might seem at first glance. In an era of complex corporate structures, global political crises, and technological catastrophes, we often observe the manifestation of the very same mechanism. When a large-scale failure occurs, the system's first reaction is to find a specific culprit whose mistake triggered it and direct all public and shareholder anger at them. At the same time, the deep structural reasons that created the conditions for the catastrophe, inadequate planning, toxic corporate culture, ignoring warning signs to maintain the illusion of stability, often remain off-screen. Punishing the scapegoat creates the illusion of a problem solved, allowing the system to continue functioning without qualitative changes until the next crisis. Studying the fate of the general teaches us to distinguish an individual error from a systemic defect, and reminds us that assigning blame is not equivalent to correcting the situation. Night falls again on the western borders, but this is a different night and a different time. The silence over the forests and fields no longer conceals a lurking threat. It preserves the memory of millions of fates ground through the millstones of history. In the offices where fateful decisions were once made, historians now work, trying to decipher the voices of the past through the thick layers of years. The telephones of that era have long become museum exhibits. Their silence no longer frightens, but makes one ponder. The story of the commander whose career ended so swiftly and mercilessly remains not just an episode from a textbook, but a complex, multi-layered parable about power, responsibility, and the price of delusions. It shows how easily a person who considers himself master of the situation can turn into a grain of sand under the wheels of a merciless historical process if his convictions diverge from reality. And as long as complex systems exist, requiring infallible decisions in conditions of uncertainty, the echo of those distant June days will continue to resound. reminding us of the fragility of human constructs in the face of the blind and overwhelming force of unforeseen circumstances. Each generation, confronting its global challenges, must re-examine this lesson so as not to repeat the path of those who too late realized that old maps do not work in new territory. History does not pass final judgments, it merely provides material for thought, leaving us the right to decide for ourselves who people become at the turning point of eras, creators of their destiny or hostages of insurmountable forces. We can only carefully peer into these shadows of the past, trying to discern in them a reflection of our own future.